this begs a broader question too that was popping up in my mind, and perhaps this is a reasonable place to interject to broaden out the conversation. We don't really know what the preconditions are for science to function as it has functioned, let's say, in the West for the last 400 years. But it's certainly the case that real scientists, and there are very few of them, because most scientists are technicians in some real sense, and they're certainly not on the cutting edge, and they're worried about the pushing forward of their career, let's say, and other extraneous issues rather than concentrating on the science at hand. It's an unbelievably stringently ethical enterprise. If you want to be a good scientist, you have to assume that what you don't know should take priority over what you do know. That's hypothesis testing in some real sense. And you also have to be willing to go where the data takes you, and you have to do your statistical analysis in the most honest possible manner. And all of that requires the abiding by an extraordinarily stringent ethic. And yet we tend to think of science as a technical enterprise. And when we presume that it's a technical enterprise, we also presume that, for example, it could take place in any real sense in a totalitarian country, that you can do science in a totalitarian country. And it isn't obvious to me at all that you can do science in a totalitarian country. And the reason for that is that in a totalitarian country, everyone lies about everything all the time.
That's a very good point. And that actually brings up questions that were raised in a report that came from the Senate in recent weeks. The Help Committee of the Senate, the Republican side of that committee, has employed experts to spend a couple of several months, a year and a bit actually, investigating exactly what was going on in that laboratory in Wuhan in 2018, 19, and 20. And what they discovered was that there was some kind of crisis over biosafety in the lab in November of 2019. There were meetings, very high-level meetings. Beijing got involved. Xi Jinping himself seems to have been consulted. And the lab was basically given a major ticking off about failures on biosafety. And there's a lot of sort of self-examination going on. But to your point, these documents that revealed this are Communist Party documents. That is to say, right. Like every organization in China, the Wuhan lab is basically run by the Communist Party. And as part of that, you, as a scientist, have to keep reporting to the party what you're doing, how hard you're working, and how it's going to glorify the Communist Party.
Right. To the party, yes, exactly. And that's not science, man.
Well, you can do good science while doing that, but it's very clear that the direction the party is giving you in 2019 is, come on, we want more results out of this science. We haven't seen enough from these virology experiments. We need why aren't you getting more results, getting more papers published, etc. There's a real pressure on these scientists. You can read it in these documents to do more work. But then there's also real pressure to, for God's sake, stop having these accidents or whatever it is. It's never quite that explicit, but what can you do to solve these biosafety problems that you've got in the lab? Now, all of that suggests that there was pressure to do risky experiments, and there was pressure to clean up the safety record of the lab at the time that something started in Wuhan. Now, again, none of that proves that that's how it began, but given the experiments that we know they were doing, that they published, these were chimera virus experiments where you take part of the gene from one virus and you insert it into another in order to make a hybrid virus to see how dangerous the spike gene of the newly discovered virus is in a live virus that you know how to grow. And those experiments resulted in up to 10,000 times increases in the infectivity of viruses in human cells, human airway epithelial cells in the lab.
Is that the gain of function research that people refer to constantly?
Yes.
And the function that's being gained
is
is transmissibleness, is the capacity of the virus
the
to be transmitted.
original gain of function debate, the original gain of function debate was about how to turn a bird flu into a mammal flu, how to give it the new function of infecting mammal. But the term then came to be used for increases in the infectivity or the virulence of viruses in the laboratory.
So let me
that are
ask
capable
you
of
a question.
infecting human beings.
All right, so let me ask you a question about that. So we've already established earlier in this conversation that there are trillions upon trillions of viral variants. And a very, very tiny fraction of those pose a human risk, almost an infinitesimally small fraction. And so the vast majority of viruses are harmless. And then the theory would be, well, there are some that are still harmful, and we need to understand those, and fair enough. And one of the ways of understanding them is to produce more dangerous viral variants in the lab, and then we can study these more dangerous variants. But that seems to me to assume that you're presuming that the more dangerous functions that you're adding to the viruses are in some sense going to be representative of more dangerous viruses in general, so that you can generalize beyond them. And you're also assuming that the risk of an accident or an outbreak in relationship to poor handling of these new viruses that you're creating is less of a risk than natural variation in the viruses themselves would be likely to produce. It isn't obvious to me at all, a priori, that any of those presumptions are even vaguely correct.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the calculation that they were making, that it was worth doing this research because you would identify viruses that could cause a pandemic this way, and that risk, the risk of causing an accident was less than that risk that we're running naturally. There was a lot of criticism of this. When they began this sort of research, not just in Wuhan, but elsewhere in the world, about 10 years ago, under a US-funded program called PREVENT, there was a number of virologists who quite openly said, we think this is a mistake. We think you're looking for a needle in the haystack. You'll probably find the wrong needle. We don't think that you're going to find anything useful this way. And they didn't also add, but there was other people saying, and by the way, aren't you creating the very risk that you're worrying about? You're looking for a gas leak with a lighted match, as someone put it. Now, I think most of us now looking at what was going on in Wuhan, in that laboratory, in the years leading up to the pandemic, are convinced that even if this one didn't happen that way, it could have, and that going forward, we should not be doing this kind of research. Well, after a short pause, the US government resumed its donations to the EcoHealth Alliance to work with partner labs doing this kind of research elsewhere in the world during and after the pandemic.
Recently, and recently means October 27th, in the journal Science online. And so just for everyone watching and listening to know, there's two journals in the world, Science and Nature, that are regarded by scientists in virtually every discipline as the pinnacle of scientific publication. And so if you're a career scientist and you publish in Science or Nature, that's a career-making publication. It's the equivalent of a bestseller, let's say, or a hit movie in the scientific community. And both Science and Nature are among the oldest of scientific journals and the most prestigious, and they had their origin in the UK. And so everyone in the scientific community has been for decades very impressed with Science and Nature. So I'm telling everyone that just so you know the significance of this publication outlet. Now, there's an article there that was written by John Cohen on October 27th, 22, talking about this Senate investigation that Matt just referred to. And let me read a little bit about this. The mysterious origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, like so many aspects of the response, has created deep divides along party lines in the United States. Okay, so that's the opening statement. And so basically, the opening statement is designed to convince both the writer and the reader that the primary issue here with regards to the lab leak hypothesis is one of politics and not a fact or science. And then the article continues, many virologists and evolutionary biologists who have studied the origins of outbreaks dismiss the lab leak hypothesis. Many virologists, let's say, but other scientists have complained that the possibility was too readily downplayed. Okay, so there's this dispute. But then the writer continues, and it has become increasingly popular among conservative media outlets and some Republican politicians. So instantly politicizing it again. Now, this Senate report, which is reported here as a minority staff, concludes in its 35-page report that the COVID pandemic was more likely than not the result of a research-related incident. And then the author immediately jumps to this statement, which is that conclusion stands in sharp contrast to that of other panels, including from the World Health Organization and U.S. intelligence agencies, which have deemed a zoonotic jump more likely or remain neutral, given the lack of direct evidence on the origin of the virus. Okay, so we're being enjoined by the journal Science itself to assume that all of this discussion about the origin of the lab leak is somehow politicking. Okay, so let's take that apart for a minute. So that's predicated on the assumption that the Republicans and the conservatives, let's say, both narrowly and more broadly, have something specific to gain, right, in a power-related manner, by advancing the claim that the origin of the virus was, in some sense, a lab leak. And for the life of me, I can't understand why that's political. It's like it was either a lab leak or it wasn't. That's pretty damn evident. And it isn't obvious to me that the facts stand on one side of the political divide or another. So then I'm wondering, why in the world is it that Science magazine is publishing an article claiming that the real reason that anybody's concerned about whether or not this was a lab leak is because of Republican Party shenanigans? And so what do you think about that?
Well, it's true that America is very politically polarized. And there's a tendency in much of the media to see everything in a Republican versus Democrat lens these days. That doesn't work for the rest of us who aren't Americans. We don't have to see the world that way. We can think of it as a scientific question rather than a political question. It's true that early in the pandemic, a Republican president, Donald Trump, kept saying it might have come from a lab. Well, we happen to know that a number of scientists privately agreed with him but didn't say so at the time. But the real divide here, and we see this on social media all the time, we get active debates about this going on. The real divide is not between people who think it was a lab leak and people who think it was a market zoonosis, but people who think that we haven't answered the question yet, and we need to keep looking at both hypotheses, what I call the open question side of the debate, which I'm on, which my co-author's on, which everybody who thinks a lab leak is possible thinks. I don't know anyone who thinks it's 100% certain it was a lab leak. And on the other side of the question are the case closed crowd who say, no, we can already rule out a lab leak for certain. And that seems to me immensely premature. And here's why. In the case of SARS, we were able to rule out a lab leak and know that it came over the market because we found the infected animal. We found the civet cat that had caught the virus from the bat and gave it to people. And we found the index cases. These were food handlers and chefs and people who were cooking civet cats. The chain of transmission was very clear. In this case, we've found no infected animals. We found no evidence in blood banks of previously infected people. We found nobody who looks like an index case. The only thing we found is that there was a concentration of early cases in that food market in Wuhan. And a number of scientists, the ones referred to in that John Cohen article in Science, regard that evidence that there were quite a lot of early cases in that market or near that market as so-called dispositive. In other words, we can close the case. We can go home, shut up the inquiry, and say we know for certain it came out of that. And the rest of us say, no, hang on, you haven't found an infected animal, you haven't found an early case. And by the way, we know why there was a concentration of cases in that market, because in the early days of the pandemic, if you had pneumonia and you went to hospital, they were told to consider COVID as a cause only if you lived near that market. So it's a circular argument. Of course, the early cases were near the market because that's the only place they were looking. It's like the drunk who says, I'm looking for my car keys under this street light because that's where the light is. Again, I'm not making the case that the market couldn't have been the place where it happened. I'm making the case that we can't definitively conclude that yet.
Well, you're making a stronger case. Well, you're making a stronger case than that, I would say, in some sense, because you're saying that when we've done similar things previously, we've been able to find animals who had that virus variant, and we just haven't been able to find those animals at all. So what you're saying is that the only evidence that it came from the market is that there are cases that were reported earlier that were associated with the market. But that's the only piece of evidence that it's coming from the market. And so I